Dr. Elena Nicoladis is professor and head of the Department of Psychology at UBC Okanagan. I have to admit that I've admired Elena's work since she was a graduate student at McGill, working with Fred Genesee. There was this star coming out of his lab. There were actually two of them at the time, you and Joanne Pardee. And I've been following her work ever since. I was thrilled that last year UBC snagged her away from University of Alberta, where she's been a professor in the psychology department. And actually, I think you've been there most of your career. To bring her out to UBC Okanagan to head up the psychology department there. So we're really lucky to have Elena part of our UBC community, and already connections between UBC Okanagan and UBC Point Grey are getting even stronger. So this is really wonderful. Elena is one of the most productive and influential researchers in the field today in language acquisition and use. She's been continuously funded by both INSERC and SSHRC throughout her career, which is crazy. She has a prolific publication record. I stopped counting at 100. And high H index, really impactful, et cetera. Her research interests include bilingual language learning, mostly with children, which is where I know her work most. She studies gesture use, cross-linguistic and or cross-cultural similarities and differences in language learning and processing, thinking for speaking, and the relationship between language and thought. She has strong opinions on these topics, so she will not mind at all being challenged with questions. Today, she's going to share some of her recent research on the relation between language and thought with her talk, When Cows and Pencils Are Boys, English Speakers' Intuitions About the Gender of Things. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Janet, for the generous introduction. And I thank you all for being here for this group therapy session where you are doing the therapy for me, because this has been a topic that I have been obsessed with. I believe it's a clinical diagnosis that I'm talking about here. And this particular line of research started when my older daughter was about 3 years of age, and she had a very, very large collection of stuffed animals. And I noticed that her giraffes, the large collection of giraffes, all had female names, and all of the zebras, because there was a large collection of zebras too, had male names. She spoke only French at the time, and the word for zebra in French is masculine, and the word for giraffe is feminine. So I was wondering, maybe there's something about grammatical gender going on there. So she's thinking about the giraffes as feminine kinds of creatures because of the feminineness of the word of that, and maybe the zebras are more masculine because of that. So this line of research started because of that, and I was really interested to track down, is there anything to that for children, particularly the young children there that we're talking about? So does their language affect their thought? And this is a big issue, of course, and it comes up all the time, and I think me, like many other people, have had this idea that there must be something to it. The idea certainly underlies this idea of using pronouns in a particular way, or to avoid unconscious bias, for example. So I'm sitting on a SSHRC committee this term, where we have been instructed that we should use ungendered or genderless pronouns when we're speaking in English about candidates in order to reduce that unconscious bias. In French, they gave us no genderless pronoun options, so we are supposed to use nouns every single time. I'm kind of going, oh, the pronouns came into languages for very good reasons. That's going to be really awkward. So I wonder how often we're just going to switch into English to avoid that particular issue. But this idea that that we can, if we're using a particular genderless pronoun, then we can then avoid unconscious bias, is based on this kind of idea that the language that you use affects how you're thinking. not the first person to be talking about this, and why? This was working, and there we go. Of course, this is a long-standing idea, and this idea behind linguistic relativity, that the language that we habitually use affects how one conceptualizes the world. So a lot of work has been done in color terms for a long time, grammatical gender too, and the results to date are, yeah, well, confusing. So there's failures to replicate included, and then some people find effects of language on thought, and others don't, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So how can it be that the results are so mixed? So some people have said, well, maybe there's other variables to consider, right? So maybe there's something going on with the domain, so the particular semantic domain, or maybe there's something versus abstract or concrete. So maybe if you're thinking about space, for example, that's really concrete. So maybe the language doesn't affect it, it's more your experience. But if you're thinking about something about time, which is abstract, then maybe that has more to do with language. There's more room for language to affect your thinking. Other people have thrown out the ideas of maybe it's response time. So if you're just doing something really quick and you're button pressing or something like that, then maybe your language might be affecting your thought. And if you have longer time to think about it, maybe you start thinking in other kinds of ways. So I'm just throwing out a couple of variables, but there's a whole bunch of ideas floating out there in terms of maybe there's some other kinds of variables that are intervening here. So the way that this research started was I was thinking, well, maybe there might be something going on developmentally too. Young children, and I'm not the first person to throw this idea out here, but maybe young children, maybe in the 3 to 5 year old range, might not show these effects. One way to be thinking about this is that what the hypothesis is really about habitual use of language. So how long do you have to use a language until it becomes habitual? So maybe it's years. So at least part of the developmental idea is that maybe there's just years of using a language before it becomes a habit and then starts to influence your thought. Older children, maybe 8 to 10 years, might maybe show effects of language and thought. And there's also some really interesting evidence that right around middle childhood, there's developmental changes in semantic organization of the lexicon. And so right in middle childhood, so maybe there's ways in which that kind of reorganization might also affect how language and thought are related. So this talk has a rather unusual organization. I am going to take you through 5 studies that I show you my obsession, my level of obsession with this idea. And if you're looking at your watch right now thinking, 5 studies, how long? I do have the 3-hour time slot, right? We'll go through these really, really quickly. And what I'm going to be trying to focus you on is my increasing frustration as time goes on for how to think about the what the results are. But I'm also going to be trying to highlight some of the results that I think are giving us some clues about something interesting that might be going on here. So all of the study started off really looking at the effects of grammatical gender on thinking. So kind of the idea here is that, okay, maybe there are things in the world, and then if you use a language habitually that has grammatical gender, then those things take on that kind of quality in your mind. So if you, for example, if you speak a language like French or Spanish, where the word for apple is feminine, maybe apples have kind of a feminine quality or something like that. You are looking unbelievably unimpressed with this slide. Do you know how long I spent trying to get feminine kinds of characteristics? Thank you, on an apple. Languages that are gender neutral or for which apple is, there are neuter genders in some languages, and maybe apples don't take on any sort of genderish characteristics. And languages in which apple is masculine might take on more masculine kinds of qualities. So that's kind of the idea here. Well, because it's about thought, one of the things that's going to be key in the studies that are coming up is I'm going to be doing a lot of research with bilingual children. And one of the things we did in these studies was we asked them in English. And what we're thinking is maybe there's something about their other language that is affecting how they're going to be responding in English, right? So if it's about thought, then we should see this transfer across languages. So one study that we did was with 8 to 10-year-olds. They were French-English bilinguals. We also included a comparison group of English monolinguals. And in English, so here's the key part, in English, we asked them whether 16 different objects, so things like some were animate and some were inanimate, so steak, a fork, a pencil, and so on, were boys or girls. 8 of these had feminine names in French, and 8 had masculine names. For this age group, we did have to throw out "ça" because it turned out all of the kids said that "ça" was a boy. Now, when we started off the study, one of the things that we thought is that the English monolinguals are going to look at us like we've grown an extra head or something like that. So when we go to English monolinguals and we say, "This pencil here, is this a boy or a girl?" We're kind of going, they're going to look at us and go, So we were expecting a lot of things like, "I don't know," or "both," or "what day are we talking about," or something like that. And astonishingly, they answered. So they gave us, by and large, even English monolinguals told us boy or girl, boy or girl, boy or girl, and gave us answers that seemed sensible to that, which is probably deep psychologically because children, and probably adults too, if you ask them questions, they seem to think that if you're asking them, they should probably know the answer. So the English monolingual children classified 7 out of 15 of these objects according to French gender, which did not differ from chance. That's excellent because they don't speak French, so we should be showing no signs of the grammatical gender in French on these objects, so completely at chance, right? That's good. The bilinguals classified 9 out of 15 according to the French gender, which is significantly higher than chance. But I also want you to notice, here's frustration point number 1. We're talking about the difference between 7 and 9, and it's still nowhere near the majority of these objects. So it's kind of a disappointing, yes, technically I can get it published, yay, but kind of disappointing in terms of, why didn't you? Thank you. And there's something here that sorry, I don't have a chance to see my slides. So yeah, I'm going to show you that a little bit later. I'm going to orient you to this graph here because you're going to see another one that looks like this as well to it. But it was what I've got graphed here are all of the 15 different objects that we had given to the children. And out of the number of children who gave us an answer, the number who gave us a boy rather than a girl response. So the longer the line, the more boy responses they gave. That first group of objects up at the top there, like the zebra, for example, those were masculine objects in French. And then the second grouping of objects were ones that are feminine in French. So if we're seeing massive effects of gender, the bilingual kids should show very, very long lines up at the beginning and very, very short lines towards the bottom, right? And another thing that we should see is that the bilinguals who are in black would be longer up at the top than the monolinguals and shorter at the bottom than the monolinguals. So that's kind of true. If I let you a long time to look at this, you would kind of squint at it and kind of go, okay, yeah, well, there's something kind of going on there. And that kind of corresponds to that. But there's some really notable exceptions. For example, frog, for example, which is a feminine noun in French, bilinguals and monolinguals just gave it equally rated as boys and had a strong boy tendency as well. So I'm not going to walk you through all of this. if you squint it, you can kind of squint at this and see that there is something going on that kind of corresponds to it. But again, really kind of disappointingly small results for given how strong I was going into this, at least thinking that language was affecting how they were thinking. So bilinguals did show some effects of the French gender in their classification of these objects. But here's one of the things that was really, really incredible that I was thinking, okay, this is giving us a clue to something else that's going on here that's really interesting here. So the percentage of children who classified these objects in the same way was really, really high. So this is basically saying the bilinguals and the monolinguals are classifying the objects pretty much in the same way. So yes, there's effects of French gender, so that's explaining a little bit of what's going on. But maybe there's something else going on here. So maybe there's something going on with the bilinguals and the monolinguals are conceptualizing, are picking out whether boys or girls are depending on the object itself. And really, so they agree by and large on that. The next study I did was really getting at the same idea now with younger children, also French-English bilinguals and also English monolinguals. So we were kind of wondering, are we going to see the same kinds of results with these younger children? And the monolingual children classified most of the objects as boys, significantly above chance, but not, they didn't use French gender. Again, excellent, because the English monolinguals shouldn't know French, so they shouldn't be using French gender. Woo, whoops. But they're showing a boy bias. And so most of these objects that they classified as boys. The bilingual children's classifications did not differ from chance significantly, but were also not related to French gender. And you can see this 10 out of 16 and 9 out of 16, small difference here. So there's something quite similar in terms of the way, and so the bilinguals are showing a slight boy bias with these things as well. Something that's going on there. So here again, we've got the masculine objects in French, so words that are masculine in French, and the feminine objects down here at the bottom. And one of the things that I was hoping that now I'm looking at it doesn't seem quite so striking, but when I was looking at it all by myself alone, it's sort of, I was thinking, yeah, you can really see that they're choosing the same kind of gender for a lot of the objects. And you can kind of see that. So like cat, for example, a masculine noun in French, actually this line in the middle shows you the halfway point. The kids are showing actually a slight girl bias for cat. Turtle, a feminine noun in French, both bilingual and monolingual kids are showing a strong boy bias. Since most of the lines go over that halfway point, most of the kids are classifying most objects as boys, is what's going on here. But there's this interesting correspondence between what the bilingual children and the monolingual children are doing. Okay, here's a hint number 2 that might get us some idea of what's actually going on here. The results differed by the participants' gender. So here's the columns on the left are the columns for the male participants, and here's the columns on the right are the female participants. And the first thing to notice is the 2 columns on the left are taller than the 2 columns on the right. So what that means is that the male participants, the boys in our study, were classifying more objects as boys than the girls who were classifying less. So the boys show a really, really strong boy bias for everything we ask them about, and the girls show at least a reduced boy bias. So that's the first thing to notice. There's another thing going on here too, which is that the bilinguals are in the striped column and the monolinguals are in the white columns here. You can see it particularly in the female participants, although statistically it also applied to the male participants as well, that the bilinguals are showing less of a boy bias than the monolinguals. So what's going on with that? So again, Oh, I forgot to tell you something that was critical here, and I'm glad I put it into the slides. We did also test the children's knowledge of the grammatical gender in French. So we just made sure that they actually knew what was the correct gender, and they did. So they know they know the gender of these objects, and yet they're not being influenced by the French gender in their classifications here. But there's a couple of things going on that maybe there's two things going on. One is that the bilinguals and the monolinguals are often classifying objects in the same way here again. And then we're also seeing that the bilinguals are kind of more willing to say that things could be girls. So one possibility is that maybe knowing a language with a grammatical gender doesn't really so much affect an object by object, but kind of allows you to think that objects could be girls, which maybe speaking only English doesn't allow you to do it. We then went on, did I tell you about the part where this became an obsession? We then went on to do this with Russian English bilinguals. Russian has a three-way gender system, masculine, feminine, and neuter, where usually the masculine is considered the default among the genders, because most words out of those three genders are masculine. We didn't get any effect of Russian gender in the object classification when we asked them in English or in Russian. We did this both in Russian and in English in this one. The girls, again, classified more objects as girls than boys did. Again, something going on with children's own gender. What's going on with their own gender? And their classifications, I'm going to show you this again in another slide, that their classifications among the Russian English bilinguals were highly correlated with those of English monolingual adults. I'll show you that again in a minute. So, since I've got it here, let me just kind of walk you through that one more time, exactly what it means. So as I will show you, we had English monolinguals classifying objects into boys, girls, and so on. And the English monolingual adults, their classification of those particular objects was highly correlated with those of the Russian English bilinguals in both of their languages. One result that we got here that because this was the first time we did it in the bilinguals, both of the bilinguals languages, we did get more boy classifications in Russian than in English across kind of all of the children. And what is the explanation for that? I don't know, but still not according to Russian gender. So still just more boy classifications altogether. So here's some of the results with the English monolinguals. So we asked English monolingual adults who had grown up in Canada, what we asked them to do was we gave them a long list of words. So it was dead boring. They were doing this for course credit. They wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. And we just said, okay, for each of these objects, is this a boy or a girl? And then just go, 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 go. I try to give you the methodology a little bit here because when I tell you that the English monolinguals, the vast majority of them classified a cow as a boy, I want you to understand that we did not give them time to think about this. I suspect their biology is good and that if we had given them time, they would have come up with cows as girls. But we just gave them, they were really, really quick on this. And then we pulled out the objects that we had given to the French-English bilinguals before. And one of the, what I would like you to notice here are just all the stars here. We get really, really, really high correlations here between how the monolingual adults classified objects as boys or girls and how French-English bilinguals classified them and how English monolinguals classified them. So cats tend to be girls. By the way, dogs tend to be boys too. I was talking about these results at one point to the mother of a couple of preschoolers, and she said, of course, everybody knows that. That's how the biology works. All cats are girls and all, oh, okay. missed the prerequisite on that one. So really, really high correlation. And then also with both with monolinguals and with bilinguals, and in French English bilinguals as well. So by and large, what's going on here is that people are classifying these in the same way. People who have grown up in Canada, they're classifying these objects in the same way as kind of boys or girls. I threw study number 5 in here just to really illustrate how obsessed I am. We're still in the middle of collecting data with the Greek-speaking children, but one of the things we started wondering is, could there be something going on here with just the fact that we're comparing, say, bilinguals to monolinguals or something like that. And so we thought it would be really interesting to have bilinguals who speak 2 gender neutral languages in the studies to see if there's any kind of effect for bilingualism. So we had a group of Cantonese English bilinguals, English monolinguals. Cantonese is really interesting because in the spoken form, there's no difference between the gender of the pronouns. In the written form there is, but in the spoken form, and these are preschoolers, so we're assuming that they don't read and write, and so maybe they don't know that yet. So we thought, oh, that would be really interesting to see what's going on with Cantonese English bilinguals, English monolinguals, French English bilinguals. We're not through collecting the Greek English bilingual data because it turns out that Greek speakers are hard to find, but at least where I'm looking for them, and then Russian English bilinguals as well. So French has a 2-way gender system, Greek and Russian both have a 3-way gender system. Russian, I already told you, masculine is kind of the default. In Greek, the neuter is considered usually the default. Most words are neuter in Greek. What I've got graphed here is basically the ratio of girl responses that they gave, just to try to mess you up because I've given you boy responses. And so now you have to actually pay attention here and kind of go, whoa, it's girls, okay. So the higher that these points are, then the more girl responses that they're giving. And what we've got so far here is that if they speak a language that has a gendered system, they're giving more girl responses than either English monolinguals or Cantonese English bilinguals. So this is really interesting results. They're preliminary. They might not hold up once we actually get the full sample, but I almost don't want to collect the whole sample because the results look really pretty interesting here. So again, something going on that maybe if you speak a language that has feminine gender in it, maybe that you're just more likely to allow girl objects, I don't know, than if you speak a language with no gender markers. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and kind of sum up some of the important aspects of my confusion here. So we did get some results that are kind of consistent with developmental changes in grammatical gender affecting thinking. So we did show that technically speaking, statistically speaking, the older children between the 8 to 10 years of age are showing signs of grammatical gender in how they're classifying objects. Younger children allow that things can be girls, or at least more often than English monolinguals. So there might be something going on with speaking a gendered language, but in younger children, we're not seeing these effects of grammatical gender on how they're thinking. Some of the results that we got here were really, really surprising for me kind of going into this. So while some of this kind of shows a developmental change, I kind of feel like that's missing the point of what these data are telling us. These data seem to be showing us something completely different. And one of the things that I thought these results were really interesting is that there's just a lot of agreement on how to classify objects if you speak English as at least one of your languages from the age of at least about 3 on through adulthood. Massive similarities in how people are thinking about the gender of objects from the age of 3 on. So what's going on with that? Because English supposedly doesn't have grammatical gender, so how could there be intuitions that are shared about, say, the gender of cats or pencils. It's not just animate or inanimate objects. There's, sorry, not just animate objects, but also inanimate objects, where there's a lot of agreement among English speakers on the gender of things. And we also have this hint too that at least the young children tend to classify objects along their own gender. So one of the things that I started thinking was maybe there's some kind of cultural effects on how we conceptualize objects that are even stronger than grammatical gender effects. So otherwise, why would adult Albertans tell us that cows are boys? What some of the early, when I was first talking about some of these earlier results, I was giving a talk on these results, and somebody in the audience said, maybe there's something going on with I believe they put it in terms of perception, such that long, skinny things are more likely to be boys, and small, round things are more likely to be girls. And it kind of went. It's coming from a psychoanalytic perspective, and I thought, I am open-minded, we will go and look at this. Now, there's some challenges with it, like how do you classify a yo-yo? Do you think of it as kind of a small thing, or do you think of it in the long? But ignoring those, there's nothing going on with the psychoanalytic perceptual effects. We tried. So where might these beliefs come from? So how is it that English speakers might come to be starting to think that, that objects have genders? So this is where Chris Westbury comes in. So Chris Westbury, a colleague at the University of Alberta, who's been interested, along with many other people, on this idea that how much meaning can you get, how much understanding of meaning can you get if you just look at how we use words together. So how words are associated in kind of massive networks. He works with databases that have billions and billions of words, and he's really, really good at this. He's been looking at things like the, how much can you get from associations between words on understanding, say, something like what makes a word humorous or emotion or things like that. And so I asked Chris Westbury could he calculate the femininity of English words? And he said, oh yeah, sure, give me a day. It actually took him 2 days, but that's okay. So he used second order lexical co-occurrence. And then the first thing we did was we looked at how do these associations between words that he had calculated based on billions of words in the English language, how do those associate with how adults actually classify these words? So what you've got is the percentage of words that were rated male by real live human beings, and then his strength of feminineness on his calculations of how words are associated in the language. And what you get, this is absolutely beautiful correlation, that the more feminine that he calculated words to be, given all of these semantic networks around them, the more that people were likely to classify these words as feminine. So then we kind of went on, let's try to do a deeper test of this. So one of the things we've done, this is the first thing we've done, and we're also looking for ideas if you can kind of think of other ways that we could be doing to test these things. We looked at whether these English, I'm calling them connotations, would they interfere with learning the grammatical gender in French? So anyone who's learned a language late and has had to learn grammatical gender knows that it's exceedingly difficult to learn, and French grammatical gender is opaque, and so really, really hard to learn. So what we did was we chose words that were either congruent with the English connotations and the French grammatical gender, or incongruent across the languages. I'll just give you some examples here so you have something concrete to hang that on. So for example, harp has, according to Westbury calculations, a feminine connotation in English, and is the word for harp in French is feminine, so that's congruent. The calculations show that lion is masculine in English, and then it's a masculine word in French. Incongruent, Westbury calculations show that octopus should have a masculine kind of nuanced connotation, and it is a feminine word in French. and vice versa with butterfly as well. So the question is, do we get interference with that? And beautifully, we do. So what you've got here is how accurate French learners were in terms of classifying. We had them look at objects and then just say un or une in just a button pressing kind of task. The reaction times, by the way, show the same kind of patterns here. So if the word is, has a feminine English connotation and is feminine in French, people are more accurate at getting that word correct than if it has a masculine English connotation and is feminine in French. And the reverse we see with the masculine here as well. So that if it's has a masculine English connotation and masculine in French, people are more accurate than the reverse. So if any of you have tried to learn French gender ever and have found yourself frustrated, clearly English is at least part of the reason. There's other reasons that, that fit into, that predict why it is that French gender is particularly hard to learn. But we're thinking these connotations that you have in English might be at least one of them. So this kind of implicit gender, I don't really know what to call it, really. Gender connotations, implicit gender, it seems to be interfering with the French grammatical gender. So it's kind of consistent with this English gender connotations affecting their thought. Now, assuming that this is something that children are picking up on really, really early, that they're picking up on these kinds of networks of words around words, and that's influencing how they're conceptualizing these objects. That might also explain why young children tend to associate objects with their own gender. So maybe their own semantic networks might be own gender skewed, because they hear a lot about it's speculative. You can correct me, but that could be possible, I think. So if our reasoning is correct, then grammatical gender would just be one association among probably many associations across words that would affect the thinking about the word. And so that would help, if this way of thinking is right, then that helps explain why I was so disappointed in how big the effects of grammatical gender were on children's thinking. They're small, right? So maybe that's because grammatical gender, yes, is probably contributing to it, to how people are conceptualizing an object, but it's just one of the factors among all of these other semantic networks that are going on. It would be really interesting to test this in a language with grammatical gender that is astonishingly beyond Chris Westbury's capabilities, because he's working with English. So if anyone knows how to do this, then that would be great. So one of the things that would be really interesting to know would be, could language influence thought through the associations of words over the course of one's lifetime? So the developmental change could come about through this longer time with experience with words, and longer times to associate words. The effect of one's own gender might get kind of wiped out as you have more experience in the world and have more conversations about other genders. It is completely unclear to me how this would work across bilingual languages. So that's something interesting to be thinking about. If this line of reasoning is correct, then the attitudes that are kind of learned or through these word associations could be exceedingly difficult to change. And it might help explain why something like firefighter has replaced the old word for fireman in an attempt to kind of reduce the gender associations. And it turns out even young children now still think that firefighters are mostly male. So it hasn't really changed the attitudes, but it could be that it's just because of all of these words that we're using around. If we don't change those words, then we still have the same conceptualization of a firefighter, regardless of what word you use. The same thing with pronouns. If our line of reasoning is correct, then simply using a gender neutral pronoun in our shirk considerations may not be sufficient to reduce that implicit bias. I'm not trying to argue against doing it. It might do a little bit of something, but it might just be this little tiny effect that might not really get at the deep associations that we have with those words. So I thank you, and I really open the floor to questions, ideas, challenges, studies that we should be doing, and so on. Thank you so much for your attention.